Are there interpolations in the Quran? Today I have a scholar joining me to take a deep dive into a few examples of where scholars think there are interpolations in the Quran. Dr. Marijn van Putten is going to explain his position in this particular area. And if they are, is it possible that these interpolations were inserted during Muhammad's life? You know, I wouldn't go to William Lane Craig or some other apologist that's a Christian to ask them for the interpolations in the New Testament. The same way I wouldn't go to an apologist in the Muslim world to ask him, hey, where are the interpolations in the Quran? It's literally the opposition to their entire faith position, that the Quran directly comes from heaven, etc., etc. So no, they wouldn't be able to tell me if they even were. They wouldn't want to tell you that these are possibly inserted later. But in this particular episode, it's quite interesting to see an academic come very close to really suggesting that maybe these interpolations could go very, very far back, even to the Prophet himself. Maybe Muhammad inserted some of these at some point in his latter years. Let me know what you think, but even if that's granted, it doesn't require one to be of faith. It just shows that they're trying to keep a manuscript tradition by standardizing a text very early on as the rise of this empire developed. MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today I have Dr. Marijn van Putten. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Thank you for joining me again. And today we're going to be dealing with interpolations, which is going to be a very hot topic to discuss and to find out what and how and where and when and all these fun, cool questions. Before we do, our audience is probably, some of them, not aware of who you are and what makes this guy qualified to talk about this. Can you tell us your qualifications and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Marijn van Putten. I live in the Netherlands and I've been doing research here for a couple of years. My background is originally in linguistics. And in the past years, I've had a big project on the question of where does Arabic come from? That's basically what I got interested in originally. You know, it's like what's going on, and especially what happened with Arabic around the turn of the Islamic era, which is something we surprisingly don't know that much about. And originally, I was going to use sources like early papyri, early inscriptions, and these kinds of things to learn something about this language. And at some point, I realized, well, nobody's really looking at the Quran, which is very strange because you think that's a very central book, but like real linguistic research into the Quran and the Quranic text wasn't really being done, and that led me down a rabbit hole that went really deep. Just looking at okay, what can I actually do with the Quran, which led to questions of like, can we even trust that the Quran is from this early Islamic period, or is it from 200 years later, as some have argued? So I started working a lot with early Quranic manuscripts, looking at those, and I mean, this has really been coming together. I've written tons of articles. I've discovered a new letter of the Arabic alphabet, which nobody had seen, and it's there in the Quranic manuscripts. So that kind of stuff is really, really fun. So that's basically what I've been doing, and hopefully I'll be doing in the future. And I do a lot of it on Twitter and have a pretty public face that way. So that's what I do, and that's my qualifications.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that, and I believe you've got a new book that is out recently.
That's right.
This right here, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you how important. If you go to the Brill.com website that is down in the description, please go over here to the right, download PDF. It is out. This is the Quranic Arabic, okay? And this was written by Marijn van Putten. So you actually could download this right now for free.
It's free. Yeah.
You want to tell us briefly about this?
Yeah, I'll tell you something about it. So this has just really come out. I was surprised to find out just before we started, because I thought it was going to come out in 3 days, but no, it came out on Valentine's Day, which is a nice day to have it come out. So Quranic Arabic, this is basically the result of the research that I was just talking about. So I've been looking at, what can we say about the history of the Quranic text, and specifically what can we say about the language of the Quran, and how can we find out? And that's the result of it. It's a big book. It's pretty technical. Reader beware, I suppose. But it's free and for everyone to download. And if you want a hard copy, you have to pay a lot more money. But if you don't want a hard copy, you can just download it for free. It's open access. So that's really fantastic. And this really came out of my project, which was funded by the Dutch organization for research. They funded my project, and they funded making this free. So I've got to thank them for that. Yeah.
Well, I just want everyone to know, as we're on this topic, this is a must read if you're serious about wanting to educate yourself on this. Get ready to read words you probably have never heard. It's very difficult. I'm not going to lie. As I even was reading Sean Anthony's book on the historical Muhammad, there's just a lot of tribe names and certain, when you don't know
tribe names in this one too.
Yeah, you kind of have to, right? Because you're dealing with, especially if you're going into the language, you're one of the unique scholars who points out the type of Arabic is actually coming from a tribe. It's a particular tribe's dialect. And that is what's fascinating, gets into your whole thesis here. I want everyone to know for a moment here, this is his Patreon. And in his Patreon, of course, you could join behind the scenes, you get the little special insider scoop of what's going on, or you could just be the fan. Either way, either one you join, you can private message Dr. Van Putten, and he will answer your questions. I mean, like, actually have conversations with you for being a participant and helping support him. This, like, if there's a guy I really want to go to about a linguistic question or anything Quran-wise, Arabic-wise, it does not matter. He doesn't just know that. I mean, he knows multiple languages. This would be the guy I'd go to ask about these particular things. So please go join his Patreon. And if you don't join his Patreon and you're like, look, I'm not joining any more Patrons, Derek, I'm just throwing it out there, I really recommend you do. But if not, you can give him a one-time and go buy him some coffees on his Patreon, throw him some coffees, private message him on Twitter or something. Like, you could try and your best, or email him and throw him some coffees for his time. This is what I do on MythVision. I'm trying to make the colleges realize that people, things are going online, and we're changing the game. We really are, on educating the world. So that is my shameless plug on helping go support him. Please do.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mind if I share with for 1 second actually what your Braille book looks like?
Sure. Go ahead.
This is the book here that you will download for free on the Braille website by Marijn van Putten. Please go get it. It's for free. You want to take a deep dive, this is where it is. Look at these words, right? Look at some of these words. This is some serious linguistic stuff going on here. Go support our friend here, our scholarly friend, Dr. Van Putten, and I really highly recommend everybody get the book. A lot of stuff in here. Highly recommend. Okay. There's my plug. Yeah, no problem. Thanks. Absolutely. I appreciate it. So today, what do you have for us? What are you preparing for us?
Yeah, so we were talking a while ago. You said, we were talking about you wanted me to come back on. I was like, okay, well, let's figure out an actual interesting topic to talk about. And, we were talking about it, and you were, talking about how in early biblical manuscripts, you have portions of text that are just missing altogether, which in later texts show up, and these kinds of things. So that's what we call interpolations, things that have been added to the text over time. And sometimes these interpolations in any text, right? That doesn't need to be a holy text, although that tends to be the place where we look for them.
Of course.
They're not always found in manuscripts, right? Every now and then you can look at a text and you're like, well, this doesn't look like it belongs here, but it might still be, but we don't have any evidence. We haven't found a manuscript where that bit is missing. And we could still call those interpolations. We still say, well, this was clearly inserted. It's just we don't have access to the time of a manuscript that it wasn't inserted yet. So we were talking a little bit about that. And I think the Quran has some interesting things going on with what look like interpolations, what have been identified as interpolations, which kind of complicate the matter. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of explore that, and especially with this kind of audience who's aware of these kinds of things going on in the Bible. It's like, okay, how does that work in the Quran? Because it is a little bit different, and we'll see a bit of that later on.
Yeah, there's some famous examples in the Bible where we would see the Trinity, or things that show up that weren't there initially, even probably the promiscuous woman, or if you will, the adulterous woman. These are things that weren't in the earliest sources, in the earliest manuscripts biblically, which are kind of like everybody knows about this stuff. So it's just to shock everybody, let them know, like, the Quran was pretty established very early on. I personally think that is due to knowing and having this experience. If you have a brother, an older brother, just giving an analogy, and let's say he had drug addiction. He experienced some drug addiction. You might not go down that path that your brother went down, and he might actually have taught you a thing or two and said, listen, this is what you want. This is what, this is what I did to overcome addiction. Horrible analogy, just using a point. And so the younger brother might be able to see that and go, okay, I'm going to do something different. Maybe. I think, but there's point in this analogy. So let's back up a little bit about this, and let's just talk about what we know with these manuscripts. So what becomes very clear very early on, and I've done some research and some papers on this, and people cite me a lot for this. But if you look at the text, really look at the text, and look at the early manuscripts, not many people are looking at them. The first thing that'll strike you is that how similar they are. They are extremely similar. I mean, it's really a totally different story than with the New Testament. But even with like early Hebrew Bible stuff, it's much more chaotic. And then you look at the Quran, and it's the same thing over and over again. It's not just the same thing, like in general lines. No, it's down, not just down to the words, it's down to the spellings, right? Even the specific spellings, and sometimes really random spellings are copied faithfully over and over again. Sometimes a word can be spelled in two ways, but they'll always write in one place in one way, in the other place in another way, and you don't get any mixing in that early manuscript. So really, scribes took the utmost care to really carefully copy these manuscripts. So that's kind of interesting. And as you said, it's like, well, is that because of an example of the text? I don't know. That is putting a lot of faith in knowledge of textual problems in the person whoever composed the Quran, which they may have, but how aware were people of these issues? But the Quran does take pains to say, look, this text is in some way protected from corruption, and these previous texts were corrupted. So I think that was a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If the Quran says it has to be preserved, and it will be preserved. Yeah.
Obviously, followers are going to try really hard to do so, and they do. I mean, they're actually very successful at it. So, and then the question kind of becomes, okay, so when was this text standardized? We have an early standard text, and so just to be clear, we have hundreds of manuscripts, and every single one of them are part of this same text type, the standard text, except for one, which we'll get to in a second as well, but I'll repeat it here as well. But all of them are the same text type, and all of them are, letter by letter, basically identical. Small changes here and there, of course, like it would always be, but it's really, really carefully controlled for, which suggests there was a common ancestor. So there was a single written text. People were not, hearing the Quran recited and writing down what they heard. No. They had a written copy, and that copy was distributed across the empire, and that was copied and copied and copied extremely carefully to the point that, there's barely any differences there. Mm-hmm. The text is identical. And the question is, so when did that happen? Well, we're starting to get some insight into that. So we have radiocarbon dated manuscripts, and radiocarbon dated manuscripts give, dates of these manuscripts from, say, the late 7th century and mid 7th century, that kind of era. And we have multiple of those. Well, all of those descend from a single original text. So if they all descend from a single original text, that original text must have been even earlier, right? Because they've been copied from that. which brings us very close to a date, say, around the 650s, and not much later than that. Earlier is technically possible, but we have yet to see real manuscripts that really fall out of line in a weird way. Yeah, around 650, which is perfectly in line with the traditional Muslim narrative about this, who say that Uthman, the third caliph, who reigned around the 650s, standardized the text and distributed it across the Islamic Empire. Well, that seems to be what we see. That really seems to be what happened. So it really seems like the third caliph really said, look, we need a standard text, guys. We can't go all over the place and do all our own different thing, because we'll end up, well, maybe like the Christians, but I don't think it was so precise. But he clearly felt it was important to get this kind of standardized and going on. So that's kind of what we're stuck with. Now, then there's this other side. So I mentioned there's one exception. There's one manuscript which is actually a little different, and that's a Sana palimpsest. So this is word palimpsest, which is a text which had its original text erased and a new text written over it. And with the Sana palimpsest, the new text is actually the standard text, the text we were just talking about. It is just the Quran. But on the lower text, there's also a Quran. And that Quran is a little different. So the wording is a little different. Every now and then it uses slightly different wording here and there. The order of the chapters is different. So the surahs are different, which is really quite striking. And well, that's basically it. And the differences are still tiny. Like even still, when we look at these texts, okay, sometimes there's an extra word or two, but still actually all the verses are in the same order. Basically, there's like one exception where it's slightly different order. And I think there's one place where a verse is missing, but it's not like one of those verses where you think like, oh, that was really, the juicy one that's now missing. There's nothing very important theological in there. So even this text, which really seems to be a different text type, which doesn't seem to descend at all from this standard Uthmanic text type, but really is a separate track going back to an even earlier form of the text. That's the only evidence that we have. In the literary sources, so when we look at, books that talk about the early Quran, especially early sources, they talk about some of the companions of the prophets also having their own copies of the Quran. So very often gets mentioned Ibn Mas'ud, Ubay very often as well, but especially Ibn Mas'ud. And in these literary sources, we get, actual reports. They say, I saw in the Codex of Ibn Mas'ud this such and such and such. And the kind of variants that we see in those kind of reports are actually very similar to what we see in the Sana palimpsest. So they're not radically different, but just worded slightly differently, slightly different construction, maybe an extra word or two, a couple of words fewer. And they still report about them. So we don't have like actual examples of, let's say, a codex that we can say, well, that was clearly Ibn Mas'ud's, but it seems to have existed. It really seems to have existed. And it's kind of part of this kind of sense of what did the Quran look like before the standardization by Uthman. And we have a couple of reports in the books, and then we have the Sana palimpsest, which basically prove that these reports were not just made up. And interestingly, these companions, one of the things that's reported for them is that they have a different order of the chapters, so a different order of the surahs, just like we find it in the Sana palimpsest, which is interesting. I mean, why would you put it in that order? Why would you do it in a different order? But clearly the order wasn't quite fixed yet. And that is something we see in the Sana palimpsest, to see what we see reported for these codices. So that's kind of the lay of the land of, what is the text like?
Okay, that was really interesting. I have to say, what really catches my attention, I've mentioned this before. I'm a big fan of Scooby-Doo. I like to approach things, historians, right? They approach these things using what we would call a naturalistic methodology, because it's the only way for us to actually ascertain what's going on. So like I'm making guesses just as much as the academics are trying to with this literature. And I'm hearing this. And if we're granting the voices of what we're hearing from the Muslim side, what we call Muslims, because early on, I'm not even sure that they were called that. So what's really interesting is when I think about this, they had examples of textual consistency from Jews who were trying to keep their scriptures. In fact, in the 9th century, of course, we get the Masoretic text, but there seems to be this rise of preservation of one's holy scriptures in such a manner it makes me wonder if this is why out the gate they had this established, making sure our empire, our faithful text, etc., is going to stay complete. So for those who aren't miracle explanation type people, and you're like me and you want to pull the mask off and try to think what makes the most sense, it makes me think, especially as often as Jews and Christians seem to be involved, whether they're Syriac Christians and Jews, that it makes me think they had examples. It's not like they couldn't have looked around to their local neighbor and say, well, see what they're doing. Let's do something better than that, because you know, this is better than that in their mind, their belief, their faith, their story, their prophet. Everything is better than what the Jews and Christians are doing, and so here they are setting themselves apart in some sense. And I'm just saying it as a Scooby-Doo kind of guy, right? So that everyone knows. You also mentioned the slight variations and things like that that are so minuscule in this, even in the palimpsest lower manuscript, which really piques my interest, because I can't see the tradition of like, well, it was all just oral and someone's just reciting things they heard the prophet say. That itself sounds highly implausible, like not the case. It seems more like what you're describing, that here is the text, here is the standard, and maybe even prior to Uthman, if we grant that Uthman is where we have this, like, here is the set standard, even prior to that, I have a hunch that it's not even like wild, wild west, so to speak. It's still kind of pretty solid, and Uthman wanted to perfect it or make it even better or something.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, I think you're right on the money here. So just to finish the thought, like it's true, like especially within Judaism, you know, you see a pretty high consistency of text already. Like, okay, sure, 9th century Masoretic text, and the question is, you know, where's the interaction going and which direction is it going in that case? I mean, there's really you know, some things going on with that, but things that we call the proto-Masoretic text, right? So the text, which is basically the Masoretic text, is just without all the Masoretic notes added, but it's the same consonantal skeleton. That's much earlier, and that's much earlier than Islam, even, right? That's really around. You know, we find versions of that in Dead Sea Scrolls, so it's really ancient. Exactly. And so that's one side. So this idea of trying to preserve the text, and you know, Jews were actually pretty good at it. It's just Christianity that did a really poor job at this. Or a really poor job is maybe a big word, but you know, not a great job. But by the time that the Quran rolls around, they're doing a pretty good job at this. And so the other side of this, yeah. So what's kind of interesting, and it took me a while to really tune into this, but I think you're right. Even if you look at like the variants that we see within what is reported for the companion codices or what's reported for the palimpsest, these variations are really tiny, tiny to the point that it doesn't make so much sense that this was a purely oral thing. These texts were probably, and this is what our reports tell us, were being written down, right? It wasn't just people were only doing it from memory. Things were being copied and being copied from one another, and were probably being copied while they're being dictated really from the start, quite early on, and that's why we get so little variation. There's some variation. So Behnam Sadeghi, one of my colleagues, wrote a beautiful paper on this, on the Sana palimpsest, and saying like, look, these variants that we find here, they don't look like oral variants. It's not, you know, everybody just kind of composing their own version of the story on the fly. But it kind of looks like they're from dictation, and the dictation being slightly faster than people can actually keep up. So, you know, after a while, you're like, oh, well, what was the wording exactly? I'll put it like this. And, you know, people come to a slightly different wording, but still very close in that sense. So even before the standardization, there was already a real focus on getting this text down and writing, which tells us all kinds of things. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting questions about what's going on with literacy. You know, thinking of say these Hijazi Arabs who absolutely had no idea how to read or write, and only when they started conquering this figured it out. That's not going on. There were clearly people, highly literate people, writing things down. And how many, hard to say, but clearly whatever we see with these texts, and the fact that all these companions of the Prophet had their own copies, if if we assume that they actually wrote it down themselves, that suggests pretty high literacy. And even if we assume that they had their personal scribe to write this down for them, even that implies pretty high literacy. So there's an interesting question there. I think this is kind of taking us in a direction. It's like, well, but I sometimes wonder about this. Like, how do we think about literacy in this period? But like the written form was really important. And every now and then, I get people and they're like, well, the written doesn't matter. It's about the memorized Quran. It's like nobody memorizes the Quran without a written text. I mean, at some point they manage to remember it, which is incredible. But they do use the written form, and not just that. The early scribes really cared a lot, right? Because they even go as far as like copying minor spelling differences, which had zero implication for the pronunciation, and they still copy it faithfully. So It was incredibly important, the written form to them. And that is something, that I think sometimes gets underappreciated. It's like, well, I think that's very mean to these scribes who really went out of their way, writing these beautiful calligraphic manuscripts, taking such time to get everything right. And they say, well, who cares? I mean, it's all about the oral Quran anyway. No, it's also about the written Quran, and they really cared. So yeah.
That brings up a lot of questions about just the fact that how did the oral tradition of the idea of recitation and the actual text itself, this brings up like almost like this struggle that makes me wonder, like eventually singing and like reciting the Quran may have taken on its own tradition in such a manner that at some point people are like, it's always been this. And they have these traditions that go back to saying, well, the people who recited the Quran, that's how they wrote it down. And it seemed like there might be competing traditions on how the Quran came to be, whether it was scribes who wrote this specifically, or if there's some, it makes me think of various things, but maybe we could go ahead and deep dive into your presentation on interpolations.
Let's do that. Let's go into it.
Awesome. Okay, and here we are. Make sure you let me know you could see that.
I can see it. Yep.
All right, and let me pop that up full screen. I will not be able to see you.
Well,
all right.
So interpolation in the Quran. So let's talk about this. So we talked a little bit about, what's an interpolation and how can we tell and these kinds of things. And the Quran is really kind of an interesting issue here. Like I said, in the Bible, every now and then, like a woman taken in adultery, it's just missing in the early manuscripts. It was very clear that someone inserted it at some point. It was like, well, what did they insert it for? Was it, for some kind of reason, or just because they really liked the story or whatever? There can be all kinds of reasons. But you can see it. You can actually see it. And sometimes these stories are very obviously interpolations even before we discover it, right? So there are clear examples where people had either pegged, like either in the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, had already pegged, some verses like, these are clearly interpolations. We just need to find a manuscript to prove it, basically. And then you find it, it's like, oh, that was not a surprise. And with the Quran, as we'll see in a little bit, it's a bit more difficult, but I thought I'd pick two examples which scholars tend to think of as interpolations, and I'll talk about some of the issues and the reasons and these kinds of things.
Let me know when you want me to. Okay.
Yeah, yep. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is from Surah Al-Mudaththir. Which is Surah 74, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a really interesting kind of verse. So kind of give this layout. Here's 2 pages of the Quran. Remember, the Quran Arabic is read from right to left. So we start with the right page. And what you see here is you see the first couple of verses, and whenever you see a circle, that's the end of a verse. So you can see at the top right bottom, you can see the first verses of the surah. And very clearly, these verses are incredibly short, right? Really short, tiny things. Sometimes even only 2 words, sometimes 3 words, at max 4 words. And then we go to the next page and we go to the top and we still see, these really short verses. And then we get to this highlighted portion, the blue portion, which is huge. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a little bit lines. Well, all before that, we had about 3 verses per line. Now all of a sudden we have 1 verse, which is 6 lines long. Even that just looks weird, right? What's going on there? Why is there this huge thing there? And these kinds of things make you wonder, just purely on a formal level. And me as a linguist, I come at this from a very formal level. I look at these things like, that's weird. This breaks with the pattern of the Quran, breaks with the rhyme, with the rhythm, and like the Quran. As much as it is a written text, it is also an oral text, and its performance is very important. So unlike the Bible, the Quran is rhymed, and there's hardly any verse that doesn't rhyme with a previous verse. And in fact, this enormous verse does still rhyme with the previous verse. It's just the rhythm is gone. The rhyme is there, but the rhythm is gone, and that just makes you wonder, okay, what's going on there? So let's look a little bit at the structure of what's going on here. So you can go to the next slide. So kind of give a sense of what the structure is about. Say verse 1 to 10 address the messenger. Traditionally taken to be Muhammad, but whoever, and tells the messenger to be an ascetic, and then there's an oath about the day of judgment. And then it goes into a long section. Well, long is, these verses are very short, but verse 11 to 26 are chastisement of ingratitude. So, here's some quick translations of the things. So, and then he turned back and was arrogant, 23, and said, this is not but magic imitated from others, or something like that. So, people are saying, this stuff is just magic, or this is just stuff, this is nothing. And these are only words of a human being, right? That's verse 25. So here the Quran is citing detractors of the Quran, basically. And then it says, I, that is God, so God is speaking in the first person, will drive him who says that to Saqar. And then the question is, what is Saqar? And well, clearly that was not an obvious word to the listeners either, because verses 27 to 30 go explanation of what Saqar is. And what lets you know what Saqar is? That's verse 27. It spares nothing and leaves nothing. It scorches the flesh of man, I guess would be a better translation anyway. And there are 19 over it. Well, those first 3 verses probably should make it clear that Saqar is a word for hell. And there's some place, where you can't leave and where you're scorched. And that's how it's understood. So Saqar is supposed to be a word for hell. And there's a bunch of names for hell all throughout the Quran. You have Jahannam, and you have An-Nar, just, the fire. And then there are 19 over it. So alayha tis'ata ashara. There are 19 over it? What does that mean? Well, that's a good question. What does that mean? So we can go to the next slide. So, it's talking about these, there's 19 over it. What does that even mean? 19 what? And this really large section seems to be all about, giving some kind of answer of 19 what? Which is kind of strange because it really seems to be directly answering the question, what do you mean 19? So I'll give a translation here, and it goes, we have only appointed angels to be warden over the fire, once again referring back to, Saqar, the hellfire, and have made their number nothing but a means of a trial for the deniers. That is to say, don't pay attention to this 19. It doesn't matter. These are just angels, and happen to be 19, and they are guarding over hellfire of some kind. So it's given as a trial for deniers, so that those given a scripture may attain certitude, and those who have attained belief may increase in faith, and those given the scripture and the believers may not doubt. And so that those in whose heart is sickness and deniers may say, what did Allah mean with this as a parable, right? This is literally the 19 whats. ماذا أراد الله بهذا مثلا? So what is this about? Why are you talking about 19? What is this? And thus God misguides whomever he wills and guides whomever he wills. And none knows the soldiers or forces of your Lord except he. And this is nothing but a reminder to human beings. And then the text continues again, basically. And the text, you could just remove this whole section and the text would still make sense. Well, that's one good indication of what an interpolation is about. And, if you can remove it, and it seems to really fall out of line, that makes good sense. And this text seems to be somehow trying to answer, what is this 19 about? Why is it talking about 19? And, that's a bit confusing and weird. And it still doesn't really give an answer, though, which is kind of interesting. So sometimes when we talk about interpolations, we sometimes talk about, exegetical glosses, right? Glosses of places that are not totally understood, and someone else writes in, well, this word means that, and then that gets incorporated into the text. That's not what this is, and it's not even that. It's almost like a anti exegetical gloss. It's kind of like, wouldn't you like to know? But you're a denier. Who cares about these 19, right? So there's this interesting thing going on, but it clearly is an interplay with the text. So kind of what it looks like is you had this text and it talked about 19, and people were like, 19 what? And then it's like, well, and it, goes into some detail about the 19 and what's going on with that, and how, only people who don't see the truth will be asking the question. But doesn't really want to answer it. So how do we
I have
this?
questions. I already have I want to try and so first of all, just to get this straight, the interpolation is, what did Allah mean with this as a parable?
No, the whole section. So all this text, that's the whole interpolation. So it's huge, right? It's a lot of text. And so the whole thing is kind of talking about that. And this is just one part, and I think it was, so I put it in darker font just to kind of put that out. It's like, well, that seems to be talking about, what do they mean by this? What are they talking about? So what does this look like? I mean, it looks like the text didn't originally have this section, and people recited it that way, or, the prophets recited it that way, or whoever. And at some point, people were like, wait a minute, what is this about? And then someone put in this text as a kind of an explanation. So who was it? Did this happen after the prophet had died and nobody understood what this 19 meant anymore? Did he added himself, which is, there are stories even within the tradition of Islam that's like, well, sometimes we'll say, well, in both cases it will be an auto interpolation, but the question is whether God interpolated it or Muhammad interpolated it, where they said, no, at some point some of these verses were added later. So we have Medinan verses in Meccan surahs and these kinds of things. So they were added later. So Muhammad would apparently go on. It's like, well, I had a new revelation. It's supposed to go somewhere in the surah. Is it one of those? So is this like an auto-interpolation? Could be, but we'll look at the textual evidence in a second.
Wow. Can I make a quick note?
Go for it.
I want to let people know, specifically speaking to my kindred that I came from, Christians and others, who would love to come to this, and they love we're dealing with actual academics here. But my point is they'll go to these places. You see, thus Allah misguides whomever he wills and guides whomever he wills. That's Bible. Just so everyone knows, this is in the Bible. So quit pretending. Quit looking at Islam and going, Allah misguides. Dude, the very prayer Jesus says is, lead us not into temptation. Don't guide us to be led astray. He's praying to his Father according to the gospel. So it's like, come on, man. This is 101 Bible. Stop using these polemics against each other. All of them do it. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry, I just had to make that point.
Yeah, no. So it's just a really interesting thing. So what's going on with this? Well, so if it's an interpolation, we can start asking the question. Okay, where is this interpolation? When was it inserted into the text? And I think we can go to the next slide and kind of look at this. Oh, I wanted to finish one last thought, but I can do it on the next slide as well. So one thing, this is a really interesting suggestion by a colleague of mine, Daniel Beck, who says, this 19, so very often this has been understood as like people didn't understand what the 19 meant. And Daniel Beck says, no, the reason why it goes into such polemics all of a sudden is because they knew exactly what the 19 meant. Because the number 19 actually has a function in, say the Near East at the time. It talked about, it's the important heavenly bodies, that is the 12 zodiac signs and the 5 known planets at the time. And the 5 known planets are, let me get this right, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus at least. No, and the moon. I don't know. Maybe it's not Saturn. It's anyway one of those: Mars, Venus, Jupiter, the moon, and the sun, which are planets, right? because heliocentric.
I thought this. So I thought the sun and the moon were luminaries, and that there were 5 different planets. I can't remember exactly, but it might be something like that. This is also biblical, by the way. The whole exactly. 5 is biblical.
Right. So anyway, it's the zodiacs plus the 5 planets. So I guess it's not the sun and not the moon, but it's indeed Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. That's probably right.
So that would be 17. So technically, you're adding the 2 luminaries of the moon and the sun in there to make it 19.
Oh, I am. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for doing my math for me.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. And I'm glad because great. This is something that is a powerful point you're making. Please.
Yeah. So anyway, so he says, they knew exactly what it meant, and they were like, look, this sounds kind of weird and idolatrous, right? There's these heavenly bodies like guarding over hellfire or whatever was going on with that. And I just think it's a very interesting thought, and it kind of puts the thing on its head. It's not about people being confused about what this verse was about or what this 19 was about, but actually they knew exactly what it was about, and we're like, this doesn't really fit with how we understand this early new version of the religion. Another kind of interesting thing to say about this 19 is it's a very popular thing among modern Quranist Muslims who think there's something about this 19, and they see this verse as a kind of invitation to figure out what the 19 code of the Quran is. And they do all kinds of like crazy calculations, and they're like, well, you count the letters up together and then you get 19, and you divide it by 19 and you get this and that, which is all crazy because as much as the Quranic text is incredibly stable, it is not so stable that you can take the modern text and say, well, this is exactly how Uthman wrote it, and there's some kind of heavenly message in there.
It's the Bible code. It's like the Bible code, but on the Quran. Yeah. Exactly.
So this 19 has kind of multiple sides to that. So there's this kind of numerological kind of cult really that is obsessed with this. And every now and then people go to me and they send me these huge books and websites. It's like, you got to figure it out, and you'll see that it's true. And it's like, and I'm like, look, here's one word that has missing the letter that you just counted, and all of a sudden all your calculations are wrong. But that doesn't deter them, of course. So like, well, if the calculations are wrong, clearly that manuscript is wrong. It's like, well, I mean, I can't do anything with that.
Yeah, anyway, you can't. So, yeah.
Enough poking fun at
no, I get it. Look, you're not alone. I deal with it in the Bible. I deal with people, so I totally get it. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, let's go to the next bit. So when was this inserted, right? So we start looking at early manuscripts. Here's an early one. This is probably an 8th century manuscript. And there, I've underlined the, up on it are 19, and then the rest of the verse is the interpolation. The interpolation is just there in this early manuscript. Okay, but that's only one manuscript. Maybe that manuscript just happened to be the one that interpolated the text, right? That's possible. But we can go further. So go to the next slide. So we can do a critical addition. We can take all the manuscripts that contain this surah and compare them with one another. And if we do, we see that time and time again. So this is actually from something I've been working on, a critical edition of the Quran. I compared 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 manuscripts with one another that have this surah, and all of them have this interpolation. They're all there, which suggests that the common ancestor of all these manuscripts, which must have been around the time of Uthman, already had this interpolation. So this is an interesting thing. And just to point out, we can go to the next slide, actually. Why not? So as I said, I've been working on this critical edition of the Quran. So what is a critical edition? A critical edition looks at all the versions of the text that we have, put them together, and try to reconstruct what the most likely original text was. And this is actually something I've been doing on my Patreon. So if you become a Patreon patron, yes, you can you'll get free access to my critical edition of the Quran. I get $400 a month, which was my goal. I try to do 200 verses every month of this critical edition, and I'm working up backwards. So I had done this one already, so I could do it and show it off. So if you're interested in that and want to see more of it, you can join my Patreon and see it. But now you saw at least one of it already. Yeah, so it's present in all the right. So it's present in all the manuscripts, right? Comparing the manuscripts to one another, we can reconstruct what the original looked like, and that original had this interpolation. So this interpolation, if it happened, that's a big if, of course, it happened before the standard text was established. That, of course, massively lessens the time frame where we can make up a cool story about what happened exactly. Like this verse looks weird, it looks inserted, I agree, but it's there in the earliest texts, and we don't have a single one where that bit is missing. And that really makes us wonder, okay, so if Uthman standardized text, that was about 2 decades after the death of the Prophet, maybe even a bit less. So you have, if it happened like in a post-prophetic period, this interpolation, you have about a 15-year gap to put it in there, which is enough to put it in, but it has to have been put in. Or if we take the story of like, okay, the Prophet actually sometimes had revelations and then later on would update his revelations, well, then it could actually be a prophetic interpolation. And I think there might be something to it in this case. I think it might be a prophetic interpolation. Because I think it kind of makes sense to see, him interacting with people being confused about this number or understanding exactly what the number was about and being confused about that. So there's kind of interesting thing going on with that. But manuscripts don't tell us anything about it, which is kind of interesting. The only thing they tell us is that it was in there already. So I don't know, that really makes things different, right? And it would, of course, be amazing if we would find a manuscript where this portion is missing. But so far we haven't, and we found quite a lot of manuscripts by now, and it's not there.
So is it? Are we? By the way, just in case, and not trying to cut you off, are we done with this particular one? Let me know, because before we move into the next one, I do have some questions, I think.
Yeah. No, I'm done with this one. So please ask questions.
Okay. So first thing, let me pop this back just so it's just you and me for a second while we get into this. This brings a lot of questions to my attention, and completely speculation on my part. And I mean, that's natural, right? We want to guess and try and find out what's going on, especially when scholars themselves don't know exactly what's going on. I'm not going to pretend to know. And I'm speaking for like Muslim scholars that are like reading this going, we think it might be this. And they're trying to understand what's going on, or is it purposely left off? And this kind of gets into my question about my interview I did with Dr. Shoemaker. So I'm just going to like pitch it to you and then tell me what you think. And then, we'll rabbit trail from there, and then we'll get back into your presentation. When I had Dr. Stephen Shoemaker on, he was mentioning that Muhammad and his companions believed that the end of the world was going to happen in their lifetime. Is it possible that the reason why Muhammad didn't make a standard version of the Quran towards the end of his lifetime is because no one was going to be alive? So what's the point? So it's like this apocalypticism idea. And if the end of the world was going to happen during Muhammad's time, then does that mean all the verses in the Quran that talk about the future are possible interpolations, or it's hard to know? This gets into that apocalyptic vein.
Yeah. So I'm pretty susceptible to the idea that there's clearly apocalypticism in the Quran. It's very obvious, and it's very clearly obsessed with that, especially in the earlier surahs. I don't think in the later surahs that's the case. The later surahs are very interested in very, very legalistic details, and I'm not so sure that Muhammad was an apocalypticist until the end of his life. Like Shoemaker knows better. So please refer to him as well. But to me, it seems like, this actually came up a little bit, but it seems to me that the Quran becomes very interested in state building, and that's obviously because even within the traditional history of Muhammad's life, he becomes a head of state, right? He really starts this new Medinan state, and so becomes very obsessed with that, and becomes very, very central. And in those later surahs, the kind of apocalyptic message becomes less prominent, I guess. And of course, you can say all kinds of things. You can still be a leader of state to bring about the end times or whatever. Right. But so I'm not sure whether that totally means that it's not apocalyptic. But I think there's a clear shift between like what the focus is and whether the apocalyptic focus is there or not. So that's kind of what I'm thinking.
The other question I had was related to your presentation here that really had my thinking was popping up. And it was that particular part where he says, what did Allah mean with this as a parable? Thus Allah misguides whoever he wills and guides whoever he wills, right? We're all on the same page here. That, like I said, that's a biblical trope. And none knows the soldiers of your Lord except he. And I wonder if the soldiers of the Lord, I'm completely making a guess interpretation here, that the soldiers of the Lord potentially could be, if we take in account possibly the jihad interpretation of the expansion of the empire, and that the keys to the kingdom has something to do with the sword, all right, in real life, or the soldiers of the Lord are the 19 celestial bodies that are angels, or some celestial heavenly bodies. The question I had is you talked about the Quran has different words for hell, and the word specifically that's being questioned is Sakar, or Saqar. That I wonder if that is possibly related to apocalyptic judgment, rather than it being a place you go like what we think of as hell. I wonder if this is fire, because God destroys the earth with water before. He's going to melt all flesh with fire. You see? So I'm wondering. So I don't know. So with the, I mean, I must say, I think the soldiers of your Lord, I don't really understand what it means. Which is not to say that there might be people who do really understand, and there might be good reasons both in traditional tafsirs or not. I'm not so sure what's going on there. I'm just guessing.
So that's one side. And I'm not sure if really people know that well, because it's actually a difficult verse, this one. And this idea of Saqar being somehow end times judgment unrelated to hell, I don't know. I think it's the only time, and I'm going to look it up right now, that the word gets used in the Quran. No, it's used a couple of other times, I think. One other time.
What's that passage look like?
So anyway, so it's this kind of it's a word, and it's kind of an isolated word. It's a very different word from the normal words used for hell. So it could be. I don't know. I certainly don't have an opinion about it, but it's an interesting thought.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to sometimes you have to go out on a limb, especially when we don't know. And I just thought maybe keeping the apocalypticism a potential explanation, and not just saying you're going to hell and burning forever and this and this and that, what typical, like the Christian idea of hell, but obviously it's a different idea of hell. It just made me wonder.
Similarities there between Christianity and Islam when it comes to conceptualizations of hell. That's very similar.
Well, when it talked about fire melting the flesh, right? You see a passage in the Hebrew Bible that could be taken that way, that their tongues will melt to the socket of their mouth, their eyeball sockets will melt. It's really crazy sounding. I know, but then there's a passage in 2 Peter 3 in the New Testament where he talks about, well, God destroyed the earth with water before. But he's going, the elements will melt with fervent heat, fire. God will destroy everything with fire. And that is not hell. One might argue that's the fire of God's judgment, which is hell, but that it's not like this is the place of eternity you're going to rest. This is God's judgment of fire. So it makes me wonder, could this be, I don't know. But back to the presentation.
Yeah. Let's go for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking my questions. All right.
No problem.
Next page.
Yeah. So this is another passage that I thought was kind of interesting highlighting, because it adds a really interesting kind of side to it. So this is Surat Maryam. Surat Maryam, so that this is, the chapter of Mary. And so Mary, the mother of Jesus, right? And what's interesting about this surah, in a couple of ways, is it has a very, very nice but very unique rhyme. So it keeps on ending its verses in iya, over and over and over and over again. And it tells a story about how Jesus was born and what was going on with Mary at the time, and starts off also talking about Zechariah, which also rhymes very nicely in iya, Zachariah. So there's a couple of things going on there, and this rhyme is really a pattern all throughout, at least the first part of the surah. I think it switches near the end. But somewhere in the middle, just interrupting this rhyme, there's a different rhyme. And what's interesting about it is that different rhyme that comes in is, I think, about four verses. We'll see it in a second. So that interrupts the rhyme. It has its own internal rhyme, that section, and then it picks up the original rhyme again. So it really breaks from the rhyme, says something which is kind of unrelated to the general story, well, not unrelated to the general story, but kind of a side note to the original story, and then goes back again. And you can take it out, and the text works just fine. So once again, that kind of looks like an interpolation of some kind. So let's go to the next slide, and we can kind of look what it's about. So Surah Maryam. So, the first verse is mysterious letters. We don't know what any of that means. But we can talk about, well, we can't talk about that because I have no opinion about it. And then, verses 2 to 15, it talks about Zechariah. And then it goes about the history of Mary and Jesus. So I've kind of summarized it, so mentioned in scripture the story of Mary. She withdrew from her family to a place in the east, Sharqiyya is what it ends in. And then a couple of verses later, but he said, I am but a messenger from your Lord, so that I will give you a pure son, Ghulaman Zakiyya. This is Jesus, of course. And Jesus starts talking as a baby. There's all kinds of interesting stories about this, and there's all kinds of interactions with para-biblical texts about the the infancy gospel and this kind of stuff. Really interesting things. I think it's Shoemaker who has written on this, actually. So there's some interesting things going on there. So Jesus said, "Peace was on me on the day I was born, and will be on the day I die, and the day I am raised to life again." Yeah. So Yawma ub'athu hayya, right? Once again, slightly different rhyme, but it's basically the same thing. And that's the last verse, and then this kind of weird insertion happens. So it's verses 34 to 40. So six verses, 7. I don't know. Keep track of my math for me. And all of a sudden the rhyme is different. It doesn't have this iya anymore, but all of a sudden it has im, that kind of stuff, which rhyme with each other in the Quranic rhyme. So it says something like, that is Jesus, son of Mary, the word of truth about which they dispute, fihi yamtaruna. And it is not for God to take a child, exalted is he. When he decrees something, he says only be, and it is, kun fayakun, right? Rhyming with yamtarun. And next verse, God is my Lord and your Lord, so serve him. This is a straight path. Hada siratun mustaqim. But factions differed among themselves, so woe to those who disbelieve in the spectacle of a tremendous day, which is the end of the end times. Min mashhadi yawmin azim. So, but there's a really interesting thing. So it's talking about the birth of Jesus, right? And it's specifically, very specifically, this is something I only kind of come to as I'm talking about it right now. It's talking about, Jesus coming back to life. So the day I'm raised to life again at the end times, right? That's the important point here. And then all of a sudden it shifts. The rhyme shifts and it goes into this anti-Christian polemic. It's like, look, wait a minute. No. Jesus is not the son of God. Don't be silly, right?
Right.
God is exalted above everyone else. He's not just going to have babies. That's weird. So Jesus is, of course, very important, a very important holy person within Islam, but clearly and very strongly not the son of God, right? Mm-hmm. And even though, she's still a virginal birth, and she, conceives of Jesus through all the kind of magical ways and by the power of God, but apparently it's not God giving the child. So, it's kind of interesting to think about as well. It's like, are you not the son of God if God is the one who gives you life? I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about this, but it's an interesting question. But so you have this kind of, and it continues a little bit more, but there's this kind of like insertion. People have generally seen this as, this is clearly an interpolation, anti-Christian polemic, to make sure that, people aren't confused. Islam is something different from Christianity. And, that kind of plays into this question is like, was there a believers movement that was not that concerned with the differences between these different, versions of religion? And then someone else came in, maybe, after Muhammad's death, and put it in there and said, like, look, no. we don't do Jesus is the Son of God anymore. Well, you have to get rid of some more references about Jesus not being the Son of God. So I don't think you can really sell that. But nevertheless, I mean, that's kind of what it looks like, right? Why is it going out of its way? Why is it breaking the rhyme? Why is it doing that? So it's been seen as an interpolation of some kind. Any thoughts that popped to mind?
Yeah. This is something that comes to mind. Yeah. We haven't really addressed this yet, and I apologize to the audience watching. You know, when we look in the New Testament or in the Hebrew Bible and we're trying to find interpolations, we're looking for things like you say that break. What does this talk about? This is irrelevant, or some of the early sources, since we have so many different sources, it's not in some of them, but it is in some of them. What would be the point? Like, we see things like that that really help us raise red flags as to why these things may or may not be original. In this, though, there's another added methodology, I think, or methodological tool in the Quran that you can use, and that is that breaking of the rhythm that you don't find biblically. We mentioned this in passing, but it doesn't seem like we really emphasize this. What would you think the goal of inserting this? This breaks the rhythm. It does seem anti-Christian. If we were looking at some of the other academics, what is his name? He wrote on the earliest movement is a believers movement, which would have consisted of Fred Donner. Yeah, Dr. Donner. Yeah, I'd love to interview him at some point. But this makes me wonder, like you're saying, is this something that is starting to, the movement is becoming exclusive, and it's starting to separate itself from the other community? So it's really attractive to read it like that. But we'll see that there's some issues with it on a textual ground. Because different from the previous one, where we could at least say, well, there's like a 15-year gap between the prophet's death and Uthman's time, where it could have been inserted. I don't think we can make that case for this one. We'll see it in the textual evidence in a second. But that's what makes it difficult. And at this point of it, like, using rhyme and looking at these things, it's not without problems either, because, I mean, to many Muslims, when I point to these kinds of things, they go, look, who are you to say, you know, how God is supposed to compose its holy text, which I take as a fair point. The breaking of the rhyme with a clear break in the topic and then kind of going back to the thing, you could see that as a kind of a sidebar conversation. The sidebar conversation is something else. And maybe it's just purely a stylistic device to say, look, we're going to talk about something slightly different and then we'll get back to the story again, okay? And that could have been part of the composition. I don't think that's nonsensical. So it's always dangerous to make these kinds of arguments. I mean, you gotta think how you think about it, but there's issues with seeing this as a late insertion, at least. So we'll see that in a second. I mean, if I might say, just to be a nitpicky about what you were saying, I wouldn't say it's dangerous. I know you said it's dangerous, but like the reason why is I can handle the Bible, Hebrew Bible, New Testament. Sure, a Christian may not like it. A Christian may not be comfortable with me going and venturing and hypothesizing, which is just speculation. This is what it requires sometimes for us to test things and to look into these. But if we're being dogmatic, that would be a different story, unless we had like legit reasons to take a stand. And I don't think you're being dogmatic. So I just personally
no. So I mean, I think it's true, but I think we need to be very aware of the evidence that we're talking about. We're not talking about, you know, this isn't the kind of thing like finding a manuscript where the passage is missing. It's really a different story, and it's really different kind of arguments.
Right.
And you can totally see that someone would decide to break rhyme. I mean, you know, we see this in our poetry as well. It's totally possible for I don't know, Shakespeare is probably a bad example, but I don't know Shakespeare well enough, so I'll take Shakespeare as an example anyway. You know, like having a kind of rhyme and then going into a slightly different topic, and to kind of mark that topic as being a separate topic, you do a different rhyme. That's totally reasonable. The Quran doesn't do it that much. Even the last one that we looked at didn't actually break the rhyme, even though it totally broke the rhythm. It didn't break the rhyme. So we don't see that often, but we do see it like different passages within a surah with different topics will switch rhyme. It's just not very common that it'll switch rhyme and then switch back again. So there is a kind of association with rhyme and topics and these kind of things, which make especially this one, seeing this as a interpolation is actually dangerous. I think it might not be an interpolation, but it might be. It's been identified as such. So there's interesting things going on there.
Wow.
And just to kind of point this out, like, sure, like the New Testament, we can't really do these kinds of things. The Hebrew Bible, though, has poetry in it, and it has a kind of poetic structure. And every now and then, that poetic structure is suddenly broken. So I'll do a terrible job of explaining this because I don't know the Hebrew Bible well enough. But it kind of repeats things, right, and says things one way, and then it turns them around and says them again differently. And that's a typical thing of say, Hebrew poetry. And then if that doesn't happen, or all of a sudden there's something in between which breaks up this kind of symmetry of these near synonyms, you're like, okay, well, clearly someone put something in there that broke the poetry. That would have been easier than this one. That really kind of, that has a very strict structure and you can play around with it. But they're doing the same kind of argument, right? They're looking at like, what is the structure? How would you normally do a verse in this kind of poetic diction? And then if that's broken, you can say, well, that's weird. That probably shouldn't have been there. And that's basically what we're doing here too. So it is, it has a history doing this kind of method. It's just not as relevant for the less poetic text of the New Testament. So let's go to the next slide and kind of look at what's going on here. So the question is, is this section a interpolation? The text breaks a rhyme, breaks with the theme, right? It's, talking about Jesus, that he's not the Son of God. So if there's an interpolation, when did it happen? Well, just like with the previous one, we can look at early manuscripts. Here's a beautiful early manuscript, really one of the earliest ones. And it has this section. It's right there. It's right in the place where we expect it to be. It's there. So it's present in the Uthmanic text. In the standard text, it is there. But what's crazy is it goes even earlier. So let's go to the next text. The next slide. Yeah. Because it's even in the Sana palimpsest. So the Sana palimpsest, I mentioned already, it's a different text type, right? It's not the standard text. It is really a separate branch of, say, a earlier source that both of them came from. And even though these very verses that break the rhyme and are in there are actually worded slightly differently from the standard text, it is actually a different text. It's not the same, but all the themes are there. The rhyme is broken in the same way, and it's right there in the text. So what does that tell us? It tells us that whatever text or whatever version of the Quran the Sana palimpsest got its text from, and whatever the Uthmanic text got its text from, that earlier source already had this insertion from the start. And the Sana palimpsest really, like the text we have, which might be a copy of an earlier text, is already around the year 650. So the common ancestor of these two, say, the standard text type and this must have been before that. And I'll go to the next slide and we can look at that for a second. Oh, and maybe I should say this real quick. Go back to the previous slide. So we're talking about the lower text here, right? So we see the pretty clear dark text. That is the upper text. That is the standard Quran. But the lower text, you can kind of see the traces of it, and we're looking at that. And yeah, the text is right there. We can see kun fayakun. That's the red line on the left. And so it's there. We can see it's there. It's breaking the rhyme. The end of the verse is even marked and everything. So the insertion is there. So let's go to the next slide. So Behnam Sadri, who I already mentioned, kind of looked at this Sana palimpsest, which he calls the C1. He says it's probably a companion codex like Ibn Mas'ud, which he calls IM. And he said, like, okay, how do these texts interrelate with one another, like these companion codices and the Uthmanic text, and how it goes back? And he says, well, there's really two ways that the text could have happened. So either there was a single origin, which he calls P, the prophetic origin, so to speak, which may have been a written text, the personal copy of the prophet, or maybe it was the prophet dictating and everybody writing down at the same time, or it may have been a later source and we just call it P. Let's stick to that name. But all these three texts had a common source, and there was an earlier source from which the Uthmanic text and the Sana palimpsest, called C1 here, descend. He says there's one other option, and that's that the Uthmanic text is a kind of critical edition on itself, that the Uthmanic text collected from all kinds of companion codices and different versions and put it all together, including C1, and that fed into the Uthmanic text and became it. Well, even if that's the case, then at the very least, this earlier text C1, which is the son of what gives us the son of palimpsests, had this addition. So in whatever way you cut it, it has to have been earlier, and this interpolation has to have been earlier around than the Uthmanic text. So pre-650, pre the decision to standardize the text, when there were still non-standard texts around, this interpolation was in there already. And this kind of brings home how close even the Sana palimpsest, which is a different text type, really is a kind of different thing. These kind of differences, like minute differences, wouldn't even register if we were talking about the New Testament. Right. These are distinctions without a difference, basically. But it's there, and it's there from the very, very start. And really, like, thinking about, okay, who would have been in the authority to put in who would have been not just in a position to do this, like put in this Christian text into Surah Maryam, but also who would have had the motivation, especially if we buy into the story that there was a kind of believers movement. Why would you be doing that? We're not talking about an insertion that happens in Umayyad times where maybe the interrelation between Christians and Muslims is a bit different. No, we're talking about a period before Uthman, even before the third caliph. Yeah. And in that period, we're talking about like a decade rule between the Prophet and that time. And a lot could have happened there, but it's not so obvious, like, one, who would have had the authority to insert that, and two, who would have had a reason to insert that. So maybe it was actually there in the original composition of the text. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion about it, but it's essential that we know this, right? It's essential that we know that it's there in the earliest text and it's there in other text types than the Uthmanic texts. Because that totally changes the game of what kind of historical stories we can come up with. And I'm perfectly happy with people coming up with stories why this is an interpolation, but you can't call it an interpolation that developed, sometime after the death of the Prophet, when the Umayyads were having their own little anti-Christian story going on. That just doesn't work. That's earlier. It's earlier than that. We can throw that out without any question. We can throw that out and actually have a story about what's going on with this.
I'd like to comment just to get your thoughts working with me on something here. I can only do analogies here because I don't have anything I'm no expert. This is why I have you on here, when it comes to the Quran. But let's use the Gospels for an example. Horrible example to compare, I know, to my Muslim friends watching. I say that because they're like, no, there's nothing like that. Well, no, I agree. But here you have Mark, all right? And all critical scholars across the board just put it after 70. It's pretty clear it knows too much. It knows too much about the war. It just does. So here it knows too much about the war, and it paints this picture about the apostles. It makes the apostles look like dimwits. They don't know what they're talking about every time. They don't understand. They don't recognize the Son of God. They don't get it. And the one time Peter does, Jesus said, look, you didn't know this. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father revealed this to you from heaven. But then the Gospel of Matthew, scholars probably roughly a decade or so after Mark, wants to fix a lot of Mark, but still likes a lot of Mark. So he's using Mark, and then he corrects Mark by making all of the apostles get it. They're not dimwits. They understand. And in every time you look at them, I love that. That's what makes it so fun, because there's so much controversy, and it's not just all like what you're finding is like, was it there? Was it not there? Which is a different kind of excitement. But even, let's say, as scholars say, a decade or so, there's such a difference, even in that short amount of time, in the early writings of this stuff, in the early movements. There's already differences. So my question is, if we take the conclusion that you're running with and we look at the second caliph, is there any internal evidence within the tradition, within narratives, anything that we could think of where Umar would have been, in some way, shape, or form already potentially sticking with this clear were separated from this idea of the Son of God being Jesus, idea, Christianity, etc. Because this is the same guy that, if we go with the Islamic story, the one that actually conquers Jerusalem. If we say Shoemaker, you know, those are interesting Christian voices, but this is a guy who was going after Jerusalem if we grant Muhammad's dead. So there's a lot of questions I have, but I wondered if you thought maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly don't have a qualified or smart opinion about it. I don't know. But I think that's the kind of direction you need to think about. You know, if you really want to see it as an interpolation, you have to think about that period. But even then, it's like, if we're talking about that period, how come two unrelated texts, basically? I mean, you know, they're doing the same text, but how come both of those unrelated texts both have this insertion? Like, there needs to be an earlier source still, and we don't have any evidence of a standard text being around, right? There's no standard text that both of them could have gotten it from, at least as far as we can tell. And I think we can tell pretty well. We have, you know, a lot of data by now. So even then, it's like, where, for me, the only obvious authority for this insertion to be there is someone who could have said, this is the revelation that Muhammad had. It's not necessarily only Muhammad who could have done that. There's other people who could have done that too. But how do you convince people that is what Muhammad said? And, you know, there is this anti-Christian thing in there, and there's like, it's not like, I mean, the Quran is anti-Trinitarian all throughout. You know, it's not just this passage. This passage is kind of striking because of Maryam. But you could, you know, if we start fantasizing, and this is pure speculation, but let's say that, you know, Surah Maryam was not originally Muhammad's composition. Maybe it was a Christian text. And Muhammad was like, well, you know, I like a lot about this text. This is great. It tells a story about Jesus and how he was born and everything. And, you know, there's clear interactions with Christian texts that we know. But I don't like this stuff where he's the son of God. So let me put in, you know, a little bit to make sure that everybody understands he's not the son of God. That's a very reasonable way of understanding this insertion. Of course, then you have to assume that there was a pre-Muhammadan version of the surah, which we don't have any evidence for, but we know we're speculating right now. Right. I don't think that's a crazy solution to the problem.
As far as the data goes, though, putting it simply, whatever your position is, and really, it's okay to still have a question mark at the end of the day, because no one really knows at the end of the day. But as far as data and evidence goes, we can at least say for sure that it was something already in there by palimpsest, which is pre-Uthmanic, which means this could be a decade after the Prophet. We don't know. Right. We don't know. Right. So really, I say this just to give people the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say this stuff goes back to the Prophet. Right. I mean, I'm not saying we know that it does, but nobody knows that. There are people who take on faith and they trust the tradition, so they believe that. But it's like, we at least say this is early material. This is for sure early enough.
It's really early material, and it's really quite difficult to come up with a scenario how these two different text types would have had it without prophetic authority. You can think of ways, you have to think about it, and it's not reasonable to come up with something if you come up with a compelling story to do it. But it's not an easy story to tell. It actually takes some time to think, how do you do this?
So you, out of the two interpolations that you gave,
I would be inclined to. I would be inclined in both cases to say that they're prophetic interpolations.
Okay.
I think, and this happens quite a bit throughout the Quran. I mean, I took some really salient examples, but the Quran, the tradition tells us that there were prophetic interpolations. That at later times the Prophet would say, well, no, insert this little bit into the text again, please. And memorize it that way. And it's like, okay, do we need to take that seriously? I don't know, but it makes sense. And every now and then you get these are quite close to, in some ways, exegetical glosses. They're sometimes explaining like things that are not quite clear, or sometimes making a bit more clear what may have been subtext before this. I mean, Surah Maryam doesn't call Jesus son of God and like it barges in. It's like, no, don't do this. It just makes sure that there's absolutely no doubt about this. So if you would ask me, I think probably a prophetic insertion, if that, especially with Surah Maryam, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that this is actually just part of the style. and it's, deliberately taking a different rhyme. Most things that look like insertions actually don't break the rhyme. That's a good way of doing an insertion. Nobody will notice if you keep the rhyme, right? So the fact that it is actually not doing the rhyme, which with other things that we've identified as possible insertions, like the first one that we saw, it's actually a bit too obvious. Too obvious to the point it's like, well, no, it may have been on purpose. It may be a stylistic choice to break the rhyme here. That's kind of what I'm thinking, but I don't know. And other people have come to other conclusions, but other people have really wanted to see this as a post-Uthmanic insertion, and that is impossible. I just no way.
So that is what I like about what you're saying today. Like, you have an opinion, but you also have the fact, and the fact is it cannot be post-Uthmanic. And in the Maryam case, it can't be post-palimpsest. I mean, like, this is before Uthman, so it's pretty red flags to me. I like what you're saying. It could be a prophetic interpolation, which would simply be, tradition has it that Muhammad is inserting things himself later on, saying, hey, no, we need to add this in there, which raises different questions that I don't think academics care about. It's not in our field. It's more about the modern, like, this was directly from heaven. What are you talking about? There's a whole bunch of theological issues we don't want to address. It's not my aim. At the end of the day, I'm Scooby-Doo. I kind of already use a naturalistic methodology when I'm approaching this. So I'm not really concerned about the whole, is this divine? Is it miraculous? Whatever. As far as the question goes, though, this opens up different questions that are possible. And now this question I have as we're exiting out of this episode, I must ask, are there any interpolations that you have found that seem to be not explainable other than they have to be, or most likely are actual interpolations after that we would say is not palimpsest, but you see what I'm saying? That might be post-Uthmanic. Is there anything that we know that might have?
No, not really. Depends on what you call an interpolation. So anything that you get excited about, no.
Right, that's the thing I want to get everybody aware of.
Really, no. Now, what you can see, and you can call this interpolations in a way, is that there are some spelling reforms that happen. So sometimes, at some point, like let's say the 2nd century, I think, some manuscripts start somewhat changing the spelling of the Quran. And so they start writing some words a little differently. Almost without fail, they become less ambiguous. So, places where some words could have been read in 2 ways, now you can only read it in 1 way. So there's that. And there's one verse, but I think actually what we have in the standard text today is the original. But there's one verse in Surah 86 or something like that. Anyway, it's in my critical edition that I'm working on my Patreon, so you can check it out. There's one verse where actually like 5 different manuscripts have a spelling that is different from what the standard text has today, and that's a lot. Like, I'm looking at like eight different manuscripts there, and there's like 5 that are doing something differently. There's something going on there. It doesn't have any effect on the meaning whatsoever. So it's not interesting in that sense. It's interesting to me as a linguist, but I'm not sure how interesting it is historically. I mean, it's historically for the history of the text is interesting. It's not very interesting for the meaning of the text. But there's one. But so there's a couple of these things, and you have to look through the whole text to really find something. But none of these like, whole verses being added, or we're talking about like tiny things, and not even whole words being added. We're talking about like tiny things. Just today, I found like one verse where all of a sudden there was an extra word in one manuscript, but it's only in one manuscript. And that hardly ever happens. Like, that was a remarkable moment. And then someone else came along and was like, well, the exact same verse is somewhere else in the Quran, and there the word is added. So clearly, which is confusing the 2 verses. It's like, yeah, that's absolutely the answer. So that's the kind of things we see. So no. After Uthman, it's interesting in some ways, but boring in others. So you don't find these kind of insertions anymore. No.
Yeah, and that takes away the thunder for those critics out there who want to just really come out and try to like use a Quran as some the way I would say is this. I come from a more critical approach. I'm looking for the human thumbprint. These are people, right? And people are like, no, it's divine. And I get it. It's a faith question versus a history, in my opinion, question. And just like the debate preview I was showing you, Bart and Mike Lacona, where I take kind of the Bart approach. But people are going to be quite, I think, disappointed if they think they're going to find the adulterous woman example in a Quran. It just, you're not going to find that, because so early on they're already creating an established this is our Bible, this is our holy text, and so this is something very early on, and get used to it. I think is probably the best thing to say, is get used to it. I would take a different approach if I was approaching this, maybe saying, well, where did this stories, is there intertextuality? These are the kind of things I like to look at. But you have done
fascinating stuff. So and indeed, if you want to get into it, look at Mariam, because it has lots of great intertextual stuff with Christian texts, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but there's other scholars who do. So you should definitely have that. So clearly, there's something going on there. A believer can go, well, obviously the same story is in there, because it's the same God. So that's why I'm getting out of it. But it's like there's really striking similarities between some Christian texts from, say, the same period, and what's in the Quran, and that's cool and interesting, and we can really learn something about it.
I think so.
Yeah.
I hope everybody goes. First off, be sure to go and check out his new book. It is on Brill. Let me make sure I share this so everybody can see it, because I'm excited for people to tell me what they think about this. If you can keep up with it. I mean, it's super, super scholarly. So download the PDF up here in the top right. Make sure you guys do that. It's free. And consider joining his Patreon. I mean, like, you can private message him any questions you have. You can be a person of faith, a person not of faith. Like, Marijn respects your boundaries, respects your position. I mean, he works with very sacred texts to Muslims, so he is very aware of those boundaries and respects them. No matter who you are, this is someone worth supporting, because he's just a breath of fresh air on academics. He has no polemics. He's not out here axe grinding for or against. He's going to give you the data. At the end of the day, let's be honest with the facts. And it seems that very early on, the Quran is an established text. Get over it. I think it's just very tough. I think people are hurting themselves. They're looking silly, I think, by trying to pretend that there's just like, no, that's not it. This is 100 years later or something. No. Stop. Just stop. Okay. And just let's start recognizing that, okay? Because you just look kind of silly. That's my opinion. But please go support him.
And just to add a quick thing, so I'll probably be doing a couple of Twitter threads in the coming month to kind of summarize my book for the people who will be extremely confused by what it's about. I think I'll do a little chapter by chapter thing, so that's something you can look forward to. So also follow me on Twitter, which is at PhDnix, just like my Patreon, actually. So you can find me there, and or you can just type my name, which people always mistype. So maybe it's better to do PhDnix. So be sure to check it out. And if you're interested in what my book is about, but are very confused by all the weird science and linguistic stuff that's in there, I'll try to summarize it in a nice way on my Twitter on the coming days.
So here's his Twitter. All of this is down in the description, so you can go and follow him on Twitter. If you want to know something in the language, you want to look at sources, I'm telling you, he's your guy. He will be the one who can really get in there, dig in deep. And I have the utmost respect for you, Dr. Van Putten. I hope more people will actually go and support you, follow you, learn from you, because you bring up very interesting questions that make me, like I said, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I have to. I feel like it's necessary. Nobody's saying this as an atheist. I say this openly. I love the stories. I love finding out, like when I listen to After the Prophet, right? When I listen to the book on Audible, and just hearing about what happened early on, it gave me a picture, even though maybe most of that may not be guaranteed historical fact. It just, some of it might be story and legend and things like that. But with what you're making me do is you're making me want to like open up the question in my head. All right, so this text is early on. what was really going on. Because if this is the case, and it seems that it is, now we need to reevaluate what was going on in early Islam. We call it Islam. It probably wasn't called that for a while. But what was going on in Muhammad's life? What happened with Umar? What is going on? And I want to really open up the can of apocalypticism, just because that's what helped me in Christianity kind of figure out some stuff. So I wonder if there's something more to it. I don't know. Yeah. Thank you so much. Is there any final words you'd like to tell our audience?
No, this was fun. It was fun to kind of go into this problem. It's something I was writing a paper about it a while ago, and then we started talking about it. I was like, oh yeah, no, it's fun to kind of get this weird thing. It's like you have these interpolations, and everybody's like, it's clearly an interpolation. It's like, okay, yeah, it's a clearly an interpolation, but I mean, what do we do with manuscript? So, and here I feel like what I'm doing is something that can add something to the discussion. We like talking about these interpolations, but let's talk about the facts and then talk about these interpolations. And I think I thought it was a nice way to kind of put that together. So thanks for having me and letting me kind of ramble about this for a little bit.
It's interesting. If it is an interpolation and it wasn't there at the prophet, now we have to ask what other explanation. And your explanation, I think, is fine. I mean, we don't know it to be the case, but if it is a prophetic interpolation, then that would have been Muhammad himself said later, hey, insert this. So what? We have actual companions who say, or there are writings about them saying that this is what he had done. Even one of his companions who left and forsake his movement. He says why, but I'm giving you an analogy to point out, like, he admits, like, I asked him that this would sound better, and he says yes, and he's like, okay, and he changed it. Oh, I'm not following you anymore. And of course, that creates problems for him in this time and age. But yeah, there's a lot to say that I don't see why that couldn't be the case. I don't know. My Muslim friends probably love me right now for saying this. But it's true. I mean, I have no problem with it. It doesn't prove...
Exactly. I mean, it's like if you have a nice story to tell that Muslims find nice. I mean, it's like, well, I mean, if it's true, it's true. I mean, that's what it comes down to. I mean, it's really, that's the important thing. And that's what we should be doing in scholarship. And sometimes that means that the Islamic history is just correct or close to the truth or whatever. Who knows what exactly was going on? We don't know. But we can get an okay idea. And sometimes the idea, it's pretty obvious. And sometimes it brings all kinds of different questions with it. It would have been so much easier if this was a late interpolation. But it's not, which makes it difficult and which makes it interesting. So that's why it's actually cool and nice to have this. It's so much easier it's so much nicer, so much more interesting when you have a real different, a real head scratcher. And this is a head scratcher, both of these. And that makes them interesting.
I just, as we're leaving, I want to say to my skeptics, this doesn't, for a skeptic like me, this doesn't mean that, let me use Christianity as an analogy to get away from the hotspot here. It doesn't mean that this is actually perfect from God and that this is an actual miracle. Okay, I say that as a skeptic. So for those who are like afraid that if this did go directly back to the prophet, I don't know, like, think about why you would think that doesn't, to me, that doesn't compute. To a person of faith, that computes. To a person not of faith, this simply means that what is the human explanation here? Why would they want to standardize out the gate very early? Even with Muhammad, maybe there was a form of this that was already kind of standard. And then, they're just perfecting that standardization over time. And Uthman is like, we got to get this figured out. I'm not playing games anymore. Let's make sure we nip it in the butt. And they do. I mean, this is something that you should consider. So don't take anything here to... I don't know. I don't get butthurt, don't get butthurt. That's all I'm saying. So I think, like you said, facts. Let's stick with the facts. So thank you so much, Dr. Van Putten. And until next time.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Thank you. And never forget, we are MythVision.